Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and today is the first in a special two-part episode with Dr. Christine Cocchiola, who's here to speak with me on the really important topic of coercive control. And, this is a phrase that's been bandied about quite a bit lately. We're taping this as the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial is ongoing, although it will probably air after that. But certainly just a lot of what's been happening in the world, Kim Kardashian, Kanye West. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about coercive control, post-separation abuse, post-divorce abuse. And so I really wanted to bring on an actual expert to talk about this. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Cocchiola. Dr. Christine, or she said I can call her Christine, so I will actually. She is a coercive control advocate, educator, researcher, and a survivor herself, which I think is really important to give a layer of understanding to really where she's coming from with what she says. She's a tenured professor at Connecticut Community College, as well as an adjunct instructor at NYU. Her expertise is in the area of intimate partner violence, including child abuse and a trauma. And she's a founding member of the International Coercive Control Conference and on the board of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And she's got a number of fantastic articles and papers and a great chapter in a book called, it's got a long name. It's called Shared Trauma, Shared Resilience During a Pandemic, COVID-19 and Sheltering in Place, the Experience of Coercive Control for College Students Returning Home. So I'll have links to all of that in the show notes. But I'm very excited to have her speak with me. We've decided to do this as two parts because we just have so much to talk about. So Christine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much.
This is a topic, I mentioned when we had our pre-taping discussion, I've done between my 2 or 3 podcasts, I've done 300 plus episodes, yet I have not done one on coercive control. And I think that is because I have been hesitant to talk about this topic without having someone who truly understands it on the other side of the mic. A lot of people out there claim to be experts on this or have a lot of opinions on this particular topic. But I think it's really important because it's such a nuanced and it's not subtle, but I'm trying to come up with the right word for this. It's just such an insidious issue. And that's the word. I found the right word, everybody. It is an insidious issue. And, it's something that I frankly, as a divorce attorney, have seen for years. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what I was seeing. I didn't know what was happening. No one ever told us about this or explained the dynamics to us. So thank you again. And I really want to start at the very core, probably the hardest question, but what is coercive control?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you did a really great job of unpacking how nuanced it is. And I think the word is insidious. So coercive control, the terminology actually came out of Evan Stark. Dr. Evan Stark is the international expert on coercive control, and he coined the term in the 1970s. He actually is one of the first, had the first domestic violence shelter. He had it in his home with his wife, Annie, in New Haven, Connecticut. And women would come in and they would be so afraid of their abusers, but they would say to him things like, I'm not as worried about him hitting me. I'm just worried about all of the other things that he does. And they began to explain what he determines as one aspect of coercive control is psychological abuse. It's this gaslighting, manipulating, degrading of someone as a person, minimizing who someone is, either with children or otherwise, and that we call it a stripping of autonomy. that inability to really know who we are any longer in a relationship because the relationship has been so, for lack of a better word, shrouded in a veil. Like it's just the relationship now is under this veil of, I mean, it sounds a little dramatic, but we call it intimate terrorism because you don't really realize what's going on while you're in it very often. And so he came up with this term, and he always says that we too often look at the violent incident model. That's the model we use for domestic violence. And I'll tell you, if I had like my perfect dream, I mean, there's so many, but maybe one of my top 5 dreams is that coercive control becomes a household name, that we begin to look at it as the foundation of all domestic violence, or virtually all domestic violence. So let me backtrack a little bit. There's really fantastic research out there now, which is great, that like pulls apart the types of domestic violence there is. And we know that couples sometimes will participate in situational violence, we call it, where there's 2 people fighting. Sometimes it becomes physical, it's volatile, they don't get along, they don't have really good coping skills. But there may be 2 people doing it. There may be one person who's violent, another person who's violent back, right? But it's not based on power and control. It's based on bad coping. It's based on, I'm angry. This is, again, bad coping. This is how I'm going to react. I'm going to push you because I'm mad at you. That's very different than coercive control. Coercive control is the foundation of most domestic abuse. And I'm going to call it domestic abuse because, again, another really shifting of the paradigm here. Most domestic violence is not violent. Most domestic abuse is based on power and control. So there's the situational, the people who really just do not know how to handle their emotions. But then there is most coercive control. It is this model of non-physical, can be non-physical, it can be physical,
Right.
but based on the non-physical, it's psychological in nature. I'm going to make you think that you're not a great mother. I'm going to put you down, but then I'm going to intermittently reinforce you. I'm going to, out of the blue, say, oh, you're such a good mother. Maybe on Mother's Day, tell you you're a wonderful mother, but then throughout the year, various times counterparent you, put you down, malign your character with other people behind your back. And so again, it's a stripping of autonomy. So the victim becomes very, and I spend a lot of time talking about the psychological aspect because honestly, that's what impacts the brain's functioning, the brain's ability to know that there's something wrong. If he had only hit me, right? Isn't that what we hear people say?
Yes.
If he had only hit me, then I would have known there was something wrong. But when you're with someone, and so you mentioned I'm a survivor, when you're with someone for over 20 years, you knew them since you were 15 and 16, and they never hit you. Might have pushed you a couple of times, and you might have pushed back, by the way, right?
Right.
But that you really begin to lose who you are and what you know. Evan Stark calls it unknowing what we know. Like you don't any longer know what is appropriate and inappropriate, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, because you've been so gaslit and manipulated, and the intermittent reinforcement that occurs creates this, maybe it's okay, maybe the relationship isn't so bad, right? The cognitive dissonance that we talk about, we can talk about trauma bonding. I mean, there's so many places we can go, right?
Right.
So coercive control is that psychological abuse, which we can talk about for hours, the legal abuse, which you are so familiar with, right? The abuse of the system to harm victims. This is where perpetrators will say, okay, you're leaving me? Okay, I'm going to take you back to court for this, this, and this, even though they're frivolous. Or even though he, and I'm using he because most often the perpetrators are male, and we can talk a little bit more about characterological issues that point in that direction. But that legal abuse, the vexatious litigation, the terminology that we're using, the financial abuse, I'm going to take away everything that matters to you financially, all of your foundational footing to keep you give you the ability to be independent.
Right.
You have to stay with me, because if you don't, then
You
you're
have
going to
nothing. Right.
exactly. And then I would say probably the worst part that we know about coercive control, and the most heartbreaking, is when the children are used as pawns and they're manipulated to either harm the victim, to be the messenger of the abuse. They almost become proxies of the domestic abuse, or the abuser, because of his power and control, is able to coercively persuade the children to have very little to do with the victim, because he has the power. And so he, in some ways, becomes their best tactic for survival, is to align with the abuser. So I think that kind of unpacks it. I'm sure there's more to go through, but
Well, I think actually that is a wonderful way of pointing out just why this is such a huge topic to be talking about. Because as you've just, said, I mean, we're talking about psychological abuse, we are talking about legal abuse, we are talking about abuse involving children as proxies. There's so much that goes into this. And that word insidious, I do think you're right. It's the right word, because this is all happening. It doesn't happen like a punch comes out of the, boom, punch, you felt it, it's done. It happened in an instant. We can call that abuse.
Mhm.
The type of abuse or coercive control that we're talking about here, I think, generally happens over an extended period of time and escalates so that that's how you were saying, you don't even really know that you're in it, or that it's happening, because I don't think the abuser jumps to the high level of abuse right away. They start with these little insidious chipping away of your personal identity, et cetera. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, and that's the really interesting part, is that coercive control is a pattern of behavior. So these abusers know what they're doing. They're doing it intentionally to retain or regain control over a long period of time. Um, and so I would say that if you're in a relationship with someone and you're committed to being with that person, you have children with that person, perhaps, or fur babies with that person, you 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 don't want to dismantle the relationship because he was mean last week to you and he put you down in a crowd of people when maybe he had too much to drink. You're not going to do that, right? So you're going to hold on. You're going to hold on tighter and wait for something good, and then he's going to give you something good. It's that intermittent reinforcement,
Right.
exactly, and that's going to pull you right back in. And I would say that you're right. The thing about a bruise, right, like, is that you see it, right? Here's the other problem. This is so confusing. It's so confusing for the victim to be aware of. And I'll go back to, I began my career at 19 as a domestic violence sexual assault crisis counselor. I worked in child protective services. I saw domestic violence over and over again. I did not notice this in my relationship. I could not put my finger on it. And by the way, teach every single semester on the power and control and post-separation abuse wheel. I'm not trying to say I'm smarter than other people. I'm trying to say, like, if I couldn't see it, then and how can the most astute of us working in the field not actually recognize that it's happening to us? And so we expect victims who maybe don't have that level of expertise to understand it. And so I would say that, first of all, it's a spectrum of abuse. So some abusers are so malignant and covert about it that it's so minute that even if you were to tell a friend, they'd be like, really? That doesn't I mean, well, so he's, come on.
How
He's
bad
such
is
a
it?
good guy, right? How
Yeah.
bad is it? Like, oh, so he was mad the other day. My boyfriend does this all the time. So in other words, we also, I like to say that we self-gaslight. We gaslight he's gaslighting us. We gaslight ourselves, and everyone around us perhaps
Joins
gaslights
in.
us, or we're afraid to tell them because we are like, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not real. Or everybody loves him. I don't like, do I want people to not like my partner? Like, I don't want to do that. So, and then I would say that if you add in the variable of children, we also, in some ways, are gaslighting our children because we don't want our children to think the relationship is as bad as maybe it is sometimes. We're trying to create this wonderful family system and navigating the abuse in such a way. I like to call, we're hopping around like a leapfrog all around our house. We're doing it's eggshells. It's like, what is going to make him happy today to create equilibrium in the home
Right.
so that I don't set him off, so that the kids don't think there's a problem. We're having company tonight, and when that company comes, I mean, he might actually cancel the plans if I don't keep him happy today. And I want my company to come because I want to have this experience, this positive experience. And he's so good with other people. So maybe this is like, you see, it becomes like this, it's like this trail we're running all the time. And I would say that there's mines along the trail and we're trying
Yeah.
to avoid them. So insidious, patterned, intermittent reinforcement, and our brain, I mean, to talk a little bit about the brain's functioning, the brain
Sure.
wants to protect us. So the brain really doesn't want to think there's something bad going on here. And so the brain is dissonating us from what the reality is over and over again. And then a good thing happens, and that event with your friends is a positive affair that you have at your house. And you're like, oh, things are okay. And that's what
Right.
happens.
So it's like you're going, I see this as a progression that is like that, sort of a little bit of denigration, then a little tick up because something positive reinforcement comes back in, then a little bit more, then a little tick up, but not all the way back where we were. And you keep going. But what I find, hard to fathom in this is because it's pretty consistent. I mean, what you're describing is insidious, but it is a consistent pattern of behavior. You also called it a pattern.
Mhm.
And the abuser, whether it is a he, as you said, or a she, is pretty consistent in what they do. How is an abuser created like that? How do they know this process? That it boggles my mind, but it
Yeah.
happens over and over again. How is an abuser created?
Yeah. So that's so and how and what is it that makes victims stay? It's never their fault, ever, ever, ever. Right. I always have to preface this. I just completed a research study and it's called Perfect Prey, the intersection of coercive control and subjugation. Because many of us in this world that we live in, and many women in particular, have grown up to be aware of the need to accommodate, to be givers, right? To, attempt to people please, maybe, right? More than we should. And that's these are cultural values we grow up with, right? These
Sure.
are societal values. These are the way, it may be the way that we're born, right? These are tend to be female traits. So like all those layers, right? And so, um, this idea that people who are have poor attachment in life, they're born, and they did not grow up in a home where they were given unconditional positive regard by a primary caretaker. That could be anyone,
Right.
primary caretaker. Um, Abusers do not have that. It may appear that they have that. They may they may say, I have a great relationship with my mother. But when we look further, we recognize that that whoever their primary caretaker was, did not love them unconditionally. Children need to be loved unconditionally with positive regard. And so I'm a trauma informed therapist, and I see this over and over again when people come into my private practice, where there is one parent, thankfully, who does love the children unconditionally. And I have seen this where I have a particular client right now, and he's a young man, and he is so giving and kind, and allows people to push his boundaries all of the time. His mother, when the parents divorced, would just say things like, you're never going to amount to anything, or, and then also would say horrible things against the dad.
Right.
And so this child had very minimal relationship with the dad, but there was an attachment. There was. And that's what happens, is that even if it's a minimal relationship, even if there was an attachment at some point that was positive, that is basically a child's saving grace to grow up healthy. But if there wasn't, then the only way if I am someone who did not have that positive, unconditional love, then I grew up with shame. And I have so much shame that I can never expose who I really am to anyone, because who I really am is bad. Who I really am, I was told over and over again, is bad. So what I do is I spend my life pretending to be someone I'm not, right? And we know this about abusers. They have this persona they have out there.
Yeah.
They're the people who go to court totally contained, looking well put together while the victim is sobbing, right?
Yes.
Yes. And she's pathologized, which
Yeah.
we know is happening in a current case right now. There's a pathologizing of victims over and over again. And he is put together because that's his persona. That's his fake persona. That's his mask.
Mm-hmm.
And he has to, in order to feel good about himself, the only way that shame is resolved, the shame is pushed down, the shame he does not have to deal with, is if he can have power and control over you. That's what gives him the ability to feel less shame, to
Right.
feel less vulnerable. Yeah.
So it's sad on both sides. I mean, so there's a little compassion in that for an abuser, not that there's ever, it's never okay to be an abuser, but it makes sense to me that it comes from almost an abuse in and of itself, or a lack in a childhood. But it seems that, well, let me think of where I want to ask this, because so somebody is caught, or a couple is caught in this cycle. Mm-hmm. And what we really see is a relationship that just becomes more and more dysfunctional over time, right? The abuser tends to just, as I said, grow in those abusive behaviors, and the party who is being abused tends to go down that rabbit hole of abuse, where what they would never have tolerated up here. And for those who are not watching, I'm showing my hand up high, or those who are listening. But as time has gone on and the pattern has continued, they are putting up with and making excuses for, and excusing or moving beyond, or allowing, whatever we want to call it, increasingly abusive behavior. Mm-hmm. How does someone start to recognize what's happening? How do they, if no one's ever going to hit them, which thankfully, hopefully, maybe, but how does somebody realize that they're in that cycle?
Sure. So you're touched on so many important parts. I'm going to go back to this, like, leveling up, right? So what we know about, and my research study actually kind of confirms this, and it hasn't been published yet, but what we know is that abusers tend to continue to take. and victims tend to continue to give. So the boundaries keep getting pushed back further and further and further. And so when the boundary was here, it didn't seem appropriate and you weren't too happy about it. But from here to here, and people can't see me either, maybe, but the intense pushing of boundaries happens so slowly and insidiously that you don't even realize that you have compromised your boundaries so much. And so it takes on average 7 attempts to leave an abuser. And why? Because when she leaves the abuse, he'll beg for her to come back. When she leaves, she's financially decimated. When she leaves, she worries about her children and going between 2 homes, right? The children may be going to the home of the abuser. I mean, there's so many reasons why victims leave and then go back. But I would say that if we know it takes so many attempts, that what is also happening is that her own boundaries have been so compromised that if he comes back and says he's going to do better, he's sorry, all of those things, that's going to make the shift for her to be willing to try again. And then I would say that sometimes you have to leave that many times. I left at least 5, like whether it was just for a weekend or I said I'm leaving, whatever it was. And it wasn't until, I'm going to use a term here, the post-separation abuse got so intense that it crystallized for me. In other words, I had to leave that 5th or so time for it to crystallize for me that he is an abuser. I couldn't believe it before. And so kind of relating back to the question you had about abusers. So if she stays, his abuse he's gonna still abuse her. But if she leaves, his abuse is going to get that much worse. And because he's lost control. And this is what we know about filicide, children being murdered in custody disputes. This is what we know about femicide, that the moment a woman decides to leave, she's actually more at risk.
Yes, it's the
Of
most
harm.
dangerous time,
It's
right?
the most dangerous time. So, so I would say that sometimes for some victims, certainly for me, the only way that I recognized it, and again, having taught on this for 20 some odd years, the only way I recognized it was when it intensified so intensively. And I would say that Sharps, Jeffs, and Kelly talk about this idea that coercive post-separation occurs in 90% of coercive control cases. So if we reframe domestic violence as being either situational, domestic abuse as situational or coercive control, and we know that most are coercive control, and then we say that 90% of those coercive control victims are going to suffer post-separation abuse. Whoa, I mean, that's like mind-blowing to me.
Think about the caseload in our courthouses right now and how many of those cases probably have some element of coercive control and post-separation abuse. Yet, frankly, having worked in that world for quite some time, there's not a lot of information shared with our judiciary and our court personnel on the dynamic, or with our attorneys, because frankly, we're sort of the front guard. We get caught up as pawns in the, who's filing those motions, who's bringing those legal actions. It's usually done through attorneys, and not always. Sometimes people are pro se, but one of the things that I remember is realizing that you don't realize how bad it was until you get away from it. That it's almost impossible when you're living in it to comprehend it. And it's not, and I think it's partially just, I think it's sort of indicative of what you just said about your experience. You have to have that space of time and perspective where you're not living under it for even a short period of time, hopefully, before you can even see just where your life has gone, just how the abuse has what it has taken from you.
Agreed. And then I would say that remember the personality of the abuser is that when he's going to get worse. And when he gets that much more worse, it's there's no doubt any longer, right? That's so the doubt will come back if he doesn't intensify, but because he can't refrain from intensifying because he's lost control because of his characterological issues, right? His
Right.
personality. Um, so then he gets that much worse. And for me, that was, I mean, there were so many horrifying things that happened that was like, whoa, like, and then you can, at that point, you tell people, you're able to share with loved ones. And I say it takes a village to leave an abuser. It really does. It does. You have to have people who are in your corner there supporting you and ready for you to return, perhaps, and being there without judgment when you do. But it takes a village.
Well, and that's hard because as much as, and one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this episode is I want people who are going through this to find some hope and understanding. Because often if you don't know anything about this, it's like, well, he never hit me, so I'm not an abuse victim. I'm not abused. I'm not, you don't even know. But I also want everyone else in the world who may know someone who is in this situation to understand just how difficult and pervasive this issue is. And that because I know people who get very frustrated with their family members who leave for a day or two and then go back into a situation that they feel is abusive. And as you just said, you need your village, but people have a very hard time understanding, well, why would they go back? Why don't you just leave?
Mm-hmm. Are you asking me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so think back to attachment, right? So first of all, and one of the things about coercive control that sometimes sexual abuse can happen in coercive control, or let's just say that someone's, like there's bribery, there's extortion involved in this, right? The doxing, like people have your personal information. So when you leave, you have to be willing to leave knowing that this abuser, again, characterological issues, is going to do virtually anything to destroy you. Virtually anything. That means destroy the relationships with your children. And if you come back, maybe he won't. Maybe he won't dox you. Maybe he won't tell his whole family and all of your friends horrible things about you. Now, I mean, in the amount of, I call it technology facilitated coercive control. So remember that if you think that you are in an abusive relationship, there's a very good chance that that abuser has your computer hacked, your car tracked, your phone hacked. You do not need access to someone's computer to hack their computer. You don't need access to someone's phone to track their phone, and their car, the same thing. So like thinking about all of the ways that this person is literally like a puppeteer controlling you. That's a scary place. That's so frightening. I mean, it's just so frightening to think about having to leave that. So that's why I believe.
Well, and they, as you said, it's when you leave that they start some of those behaviors. They start doing some of those things, and maybe it's just a couple of those things that make you think it's better if I go back. And I know for parents, for mothers, I would say I've heard also, because of having their children. We'll talk in the next episode about the post-separation abuse more, but I do know for mothers, often they feel that they have at least the control if they're in the household to protect their children, rather than if they're in a different space, but the children have to go back with the abuser on a shared parenting schedule. So I know it's another type of control, right? They feel like, at least if I'm there, I can protect them.
Correct. Absolutely. And I think so. again, knowing and acknowledging how difficult it is to leave, knowing the risk factors. We're talking life sometimes, risk factors, right, of leaving. Knowing all of that, if you can leave, you will show your children a path to freedom. If you can. Children are watching us, as we all know, and leaving may mean that they're very confused for a period of time, because maybe, again, you gaslit them into believing this person wasn't an abuser, right? I mean, there's all of that. And the appropriate parenting through that process is really my area of extreme interest and, I believe, expertise. So leaving is so difficult, but when you've left and you begin to become, you've shown empowerment, and you begin to show your children that you're not weak any longer, that you are in a position of power, you have shown them, again, a path to freedom. They don't have to be in this type of relationship in their life. They don't have to abuse to retain control in their life. That is the key. I mean, isn't this really what we're talking about? Like, and I know that we'll maybe talk about it in a later episode, but this idea that, like, we have the ability to show them that this isn't healthy. I mean, that's just huge. It transforms their future relational dynamics. It transforms it for them.
Well, and it breaks the cycle.
Absolutely.
It changes everything. So we are definitely going to dive into both post-separation abuse, and I want to talk to you about more of your insights for parents who are parenting children in this very, these very murky waters where they are separating from an abusive parent. So thank you so much for part one. I'm looking forward to sharing more in part two. Everybody who's listening, come back on Thursday. We're going to have another full episode where we dive in with Dr. Cocchiola. And in the interim, where can they get more information on you and your research, your studies, and your resources?
Absolutely. I would say they can go to I Know Your Heart, because as moms, we all know, and protective parents know their children's hearts. So iknowyourheart.com or reignitedattachment.com. I'm also Coercive Control is IPV on most social media platforms, and Coercive Control on Twitter. So
wonderful. Okay, I'll have all of that in the show notes, and we're going to hear more from you on Thursday. Thank you so much for joining me. We've really barely scratched the surface, but at least we have one more episode to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.